Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 18th week of 2017. I'm Carl Estabrook. Since 1990, this program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Our program's name, News from Neptune, comes from Noam Chomsky, who's been writing sensible things about U.S. politics for half a century. Chomsky says in the U.S. media, either to repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true and will sound like it's from Neptune. Tonight, David Green and I will try to say some true things on a Marx and Mayo edition of News from Neptune. It's the birthday in 1818 of Karl Marx, and it is Cinco de Mayo, the anniversary of the Mexican triumph over a French expeditionary force at Puebla in Mexico in 1862. That had general political implications because a French army, probably the strongest military power in Europe at the time, in Mexico would have supported the Confederacy. And the Mexicans, who'd abolished slavery in 1810, were not at all interested in being dominated by the French or by reinstituting slavery as Europeans and Americans kept trying to do in Mexico throughout the 19th century. The victory was in some sense a southern front in the American Civil War. We are talking about aspects of American politics which include the Faulknerian observation that nothing is ever over in American politics. The past is not even past. And the questions of race, war, and community identification continue to exercise America today. At the top of the list is the war the U.S. is carrying on in the Middle East, which, owing to some Russian efforts, looks like perhaps even stabilizing a bit in Syria, as Washington seems to be planning for a further injection of troops into the Middle East, American troops through Jordan, and the ongoing Balkanization of the Middle East. I'm coming to the conclusion more and more that American military planners are set on simply keeping the pot boiling, keeping war in the Middle East going on. That uses up those armaments that the American defense, in quotes, industry keeps producing, and it keeps the opponents of American control of energy resources in the Middle East off balance. So long as the war keeps going and the cost is not too high in American lives, American planners seem perfectly willing to maintain this particular form of imperialism. It's a vicious system, one that, of course, has been the policy of all recent American administrations, Republican and Democrat alike, and the extent to which Donald Trump became president is by criticizing this sort of war-making seems to have been reversed by an acquiescence on the part of the Trump administration to the status quo ante in American policy, the pro-war and pro-Wall Street policies that Trump attacked and that Mrs. Clinton defended seem now very much to be in charge. It's not a particularly happy day, I think, David.
No, wouldn't really expect it to be, but I guess my question would be, has it ever been, as we explore this controversy on the so-called left, a word that we use use carefully, or not at all,
right?
That regarding U.S. policy towards Syria, and those who are accused of supporting Assad, the brutal dictator Assad, has it ever been the U.S. policy to overthrow Assad from, say, the beginning of the Arab Spring and Syria's involvement in the Arab Spring in 2011? I guess there's two questions that arise from that. First, was there ever a serious Syrian resistance or rebellion of a basically secular and quote unquote leftist or at least populist nature, rather than the one that came to be identified with the jihadist forces? And was there ever a U.S. goal to get rid of Assad?
I think the question and the answer to both is a qualified yes. There was, I think, a popular uprising as part of the Arab Spring, as you suggest, and that was exacerbated in Syria in part because of climate change. Bad harvests and the incipient famine in parts of Syria led to objections against the government or demands that the government do something about it. And the government, the Assad government, responded with military force and suppression of the complaints rather than solving them. So that was the situation in 2011 that the U.S. And its allies, as we say, Qatar and Saudi Arabia, decided to exploit in order to produce a biddable government in Damascus. Washington's policy and the policy of its clients, Israel, Saudi Arabia at the top of the list, in the region, has always been not a great concern about the actual nature of the governments in the region, so long as they followed orders. So long as they did what Washington had in mind, Washington didn't really care how democratic or anti-democratic, how secular or even how religious the states were. And the overall American goal of making sure that in an overall framework of order, the states of the region did not interfere with American control of energy flows from the region, and control was always the issue, not just access. The U.S. has never needed energy from the Middle East, but it does need to control it because it has competitors who need it from Germany to China. So long as you had a government that played ball with Washington, we really didn't care too much about what that government was. And I think the major accomplishment, if it can be called that, of the Obama administration, the so-called Iran deal, which was supposedly about nuclear weapons, didn't have anything to do with nuclear weapons. It had to do with whether the Iranians would be willing to acquiesce in the general American control of energy flows from the region. And the jury's still out on that point, and that's the reason we hear this mad saber rattling about Iran from Washington right now. And it's quite dangerous because the new administration seems to have put military affairs in the Middle East in the hands of the local generals who are at least fire-breathing on this issue and say more and more things about the extent to which Iran is the real enemy, and something must be done to suppress them. Now, the news this week is this remarkable situation that Russia seems to have engineered at the talks in Kazakhstan that establishes a series of safe zones throughout Syria and actually reduces the possibility of internecine war in Syria while remaining able at least to carry on a fight against ISIS. So it's a strange situation in which the goals of the participants remain fairly clear. The most notable point about it is that the Russians and the Syrians are quite honest about their goals, what they're trying to do, and the Americans continue to dissimulate, and this is not good.
Most people would assume that our primary goal in Syria would be to defeat ISIS.
That is, remember, that was the point of the Trump campaign over against the covert campaign against the Damascus government that the former administration was carrying on. Trump just said we shouldn't be opposing Assad, we should be opposing ISIS. And there is some extent, to some extent, that's been true in that the Trump administration has given the local American commanders their head to carry on and direct quite serious military operations in Mosul and towards Raqqa. It seems to me that there is very little reason to suggest that the proper demand to be made of the American government is simply to withdraw, to get American forces out of the region. There are certainly regional difficulties of all sorts, a lot of them encouraged by the United States, but these are problems for the regional powers and the United Nations, after all. That's what the Security Council is for, not an excuse for further American neocolonialism in the Middle East.
So two questions arise in my own mind from this. One is, what would be the effect on the Kurdish rebels or the Kurdish leftists in Syria if America was to withdraw its support, assuming that its military support is important in their struggle against ISIS, although that's of course complicated by Turkey. And the other question would be, what's the agenda of those on the progressive left? Let's just say Amy Goodman, to cut it short. What is their agenda in promoting the idea, as she did earlier this week in her interview with a Nation journalist named Anand Gopal, to insist that ISIS, that people in Syria joined ISIS because of Assad's behavior, that they had no choice but to join ISIS, that he claimed in this interview that all the people that he talked to did so not because they were fanatic Muslims, but because Assad was killing them. What is the agenda of people on the not just Amy Goodman, but people like our friend, the unrepentant Marxist blogger Louis Proyect, to insist that the white helmets are not a front, not a U.S. front, that there is still a viable secular alternative. There has all along been a viable secular alternative that presumably the U.S. should have supported, especially in Aleppo, which Proyect talks about. If you go all the way down about the 40 articles on Counterpunch this morning, you'll find his article in the shape of a movie review about Aleppo that kind of follows up on the Academy Award nominated movie about the White Helmets, which I suspect probably deserve to be, the White Helmets themselves deserve to be debunked more than lauded, although I could be wrong about that.
No, I think you're right too, although as you say, it's very difficult to come to a conclusion about this because the information is so spotty. But that does indeed seem to be the case. Yeah, I was surprised too at the way in which the Democracy Now! Was falling into an anti-Assad position, and Gopal being the point man on the operation. There is the danger of what the psychologists call splitting, Splitting is the notion that if you have a dispute, particularly one that you're involved in some way, and you like one side of it and you don't like the other, there's a tendency to accentuate the virtues of the side you like and the defects of the side you don't like. I think something of that sort is going on in terms of this account of the Assad government. The Assad government is no prize. I mean, it's not. It is not a. secular messianic operation that's looking out for the goods of everyone. But on the other hand, it certainly is the case that the U.S. hostility to the Assad government, a hostility which is willing to see that government survive, perhaps, so long as it's properly trammeled up and or does the bidding of Washington and Israel. The situation in Syria, or the government in Syria, is, as I say, no prize, but it does seem to be preferable to the jihadist forces, the Wahhabi forces that the U.S. is supporting. So the point is the U.S. should get out and stop supporting those Wahhabist forces. Now, where's the real secular opposition in that sense in the region? The only one that I can see is the Western Kurds, the Syrian Kurds, that the U.S. indeed is using, seems to want to use, against ISIS and make them essentially the shock troops for the attack on ISIS. It's not clear to me that the Western Kurds should really be recruited, should really be happy to be recruited into the American project right there. But their own project is a project of independence from, as you say, first of all, the Syrian government. They're part of the original uprising against Syria in 2011, and also now from Turkey, America's peculiar NATO ally that seems to come and go with the wind as far as the projects of the major powers are concerned. Turkey was part of the discussion with Iran and Russia and Astana that set up the series of safe zones that is to come into effect tomorrow in Syria. If that's what happens, that's fine. Turks, of course, have their own problems there. Their difficulty of that Turkey has in mounting an effective force and also opposing the Kurds in general make them at least an unreliable ally for practically everyone in the region. But the only real secular, in a sense, force on the ground is the Kurds, the Syrian Kurds. The Kurds themselves are divided into several groups, some of whom are patronized by the United States for various reasons, some good and some not. But at the moment, this jigsaw puzzle of an arrangement that seems to be emerging at least has the virtue of lessening the killing. And that's not to be sneezed at, it seems to me.
Yeah. How those on the left are talking about this and debating about this and arguing about this probably isn't that important in the larger scheme of things in terms of what's actually happening. But still, there's a need for some clarity, and it's hard to get.
Yes, indeed it is.
And what Amy Gooden was doing when she interviewed Anand Gopal earlier this week was basically providing a response to a couple of interviews she did a couple weeks ago with Stephen Cohen regarding Russia's involvement in all this and other aspects of Russia. And also on that interview, Jonathan Steele, who you don't hear that much about, but is a venerable British journalist who is sort of in the Stephen Cohen camp, who both argued, to sort of mitigate this current fashion of demonizing Russia and Putin. So and just to you can't tell the players without a scorecard, and when the scorecard, the other scorecard has to do with all the people that Louis Project, this unrepentant Marxist, is focused on slamming the mostly young journalists like Max Blumenthal and Ronnie Akalik. He mentions them in his column this morning, a guy named Ben Norden. These are sort of up-and-coming journalists, and he also slams Patrick Coburn in his coverage of that. And so it's a little disconcerting that someone on the left is so intent on insisting that most of the left has somehow in Syria got it wrong, that we're somehow in some similar way parallel to that people went along with Stalin or went along with Mao or whatever, that the leftist people, especially young implied wet behind the ears leftists, although Patrick Coburn certainly couldn't be put in that category, that young leftists just have this fanciful idea, and of course they all, in their defense, feel like they're being lumped together just because they're not demonizing Assad with every breath, that they're somehow guilty of supporting him and being naive about the fact that the monster in this scenario is the Syrian president or the Syrian leader.
And once again, there may be a germ of truth in that there are those, and we're talking mainly about people whom we read online, who want to cry up the government in Damascus and suggest that Assad is indeed worthy of our support and enthusiasm. Of course, the last people who thought that quite strongly was the American CIA when it was using Assad as using Syria as a dumping ground for people, including the Canadian whose name escapes me,
Maher Arar.
Exactly. The CIA was sending these people to Assad's prisons to be tortured. So, I mean, one can restrain one's enthusiasm for the secular government in Damascus, given the crimes that it indeed has committed before and after the uprising that began in 2011. On the other hand, it seems to me that our concern, particularly as Americans, should be what the government that we're responsible for is doing, and that means who the government we're responsible for is killing. That's what we should be concerned about, while recognizing that there are other governments in the world that are not staffed by angels. They are definitely open to criticism, as indeed they should be. But once again, to try to become clear on what the policies of the major players in the region are and what they're doing, specifically what the policy of our government is and what it's doing, that's difficult. But the more one spends one's time on it, the more it looks like, as usual, American policy in the Middle East is nefarious and should be opposed. Patrick Coburn, whom you mentioned, probably the leading Western reporter, English language reporter in the Middle East, is writing this week about the extent to which the American generals, who seem to have taken over the war in the American participation in the war in the region, are even considering a further American invasion from Lebanon. The U.S. is apparently building up troops in southern Lebanon with the idea that they will descend upon eastern Syria and carve out a principality in that region to maintain the jigsaw configuration that prevents any serious opposition to arise to the American control. We prefer disorder to an order that excludes American control, and that's been true for an awfully long time. And it seems to be that's what the Americans are doing right now, and therefore it's reasonable to suggest that the proper policy is to demand that our government remove American troops and weapons, which we've been giving to the jihadists, from the region.
None other than Noam Chomsky was involved in this debate in a relatively obscure way for him. One of Louis Proyect's links this week was to a correspondence between Chomsky and someone who is in the camp of the anti-Assad camp, let's say, and Proyect felt necessary. It was necessary or advised for him to link to this lengthy correspondence which this this person, I don't know who this person is, who has gone back and forth with Chomsky in a fairly vitriolic way. I didn't have time to read, or I didn't want to read down the whole thing. I probably will, but it deserves being noted that even at 88 years old, Chomsky is willing to conduct lengthy correspondences with people not only that he doesn't know, but that he well knows don't like him and want to slander him. You know, I mean, I'm not saying Chomsky shouldn't be slandered at age 88 or 28, but you know, that there's any privilege, you would think that perhaps there would, if anyone deserves a little bit of a privilege at that age, it would be Chomsky. But no, he's willing to engage in pages and pages, and I think probably well over a couple thousand words of argument back and forth, which is the usual, which the same thing he's endured in relation to Bosnia back in the 90s, and the whole French episode issue, and Cambodia back in the 70s, when basically what Chomsky was always concerned with, and I'm not saying he never gets anything wrong or doesn't, you know, get any nuance, that there are nuances that he may get wrong. I don't know how much time I'm really going to want to spend trying to sort out what is going on between him and this fellow. But it just goes to show you, and it's not only that, it was that the fellow was pretty disrespectful towards Chomsky in the tone of his argument, and that Chomsky put up with it.
Yeah, I've been thinking recently that that there really is a downside to the sort of conversation, political and contestation, political and otherwise, that the internet has encouraged.
Yes.
That it does bring out a nastier side to the argument, just in terms of the rhetoric, than would happen if one were actually talking to people face to face. Okay, that's understandable. I mean, the medium is the message, as someone said long ago, and there's something about the peculiar medium of these machines that leads to that sort of stuff. It's all the more admirable that people like Chomsky, who have been thinking and talking and writing about these things for many years, is not prone to descend to that level. Good for him.
Yeah.
And it's a style that should be emulated.
Even though, I mean, I should add that some of the statements that he's made in regard to Syria, in fact, the statements he made, I think in his most recent interview with Amy Goodman, caused some criticism, I think some justified criticism, because he finds himself in the same position of having to make it clear that he doesn't support Assad, and perhaps overemphasizing that in some of the language, you know, in terms of calling calling Assad a monster and so forth. I mean, maybe I don't know how you define who are the monsters, who are not the monsters, but what's so obvious in the American media and in American foreign policy, it doesn't matter whether people are monsters or not. It matters whether people support U.S. foreign policy. So you have the kerfuffle with Donald Trump inviting the Filipino president to come to this country because he's everybody knows he's a monster and has killed lots of people. Well, what else is new, but what does that have to do with it? And what about our own drug war? You know, what about our own war on drugs? And what about our own police forces? So, you know, lots of confusion here.
That's nothing new. What's the old Maoist line about everything in disorder under heaven? The situation is excellent. So, now, I'm not sure the situation is excellent, but the disorder is certainly there. To try to make sense of it is a real problem, particularly because there are so many people who are trying to make sure that sense is not being made of it, and that the account, whatever it is that's being put forward by various governments, is bought by the populations who support in one way or another they need, and that's the real difficulty. That's why our news often sounds like it's coming from Neptune.
So let me
a phrase of Chomsky's, of course.
Yeah, right. Let me just, while I'm thinking of it, let me just note that there's there's some very good articles on the London Review of Books, free articles,
Yes.
free journalism as opposed to fiction articles. Although, well, anyway, on the LRB website, one of them was by a review by Adam Schatz, who is a very good writer, of a book by James Forman, whose name will sound familiar from the Civil Rights Movement, but this is James Forman's son, who's written a book, which sounds like a very fascinating book and a good argument in response to Michelle Alexander's rightly highly acclaimed book, The New Jim Crow, which really brings, I think, from the scanning that I did of this article, which I plan to go back and read more carefully, really does a good job of bringing the issue of the new Jim Crow into a more critical light regarding, and I think what at the bottom of what Foreman is doing in this book, reviewed by Adam Schatz, is that he's bringing class into it. He's bringing class rather than just race into it, rather than talking about a race war or a war on blacks or a drug war on blacks. He's talking about, in I think a much more, he's gone back and looked at the history of support for the war on drugs among black leaders going back to the 1960s and 1970s, when the war on drugs really got going, way before it became to be linked with the phenomenon of mass incarceration, which Alexander talks about in her book. So that's just one little footnote that I wanted to add there, as I think, part of a larger project on the left, if you will, to appreciate the important sort of analytical aspects of trying to understand what the relationships are between race and class, how these things are played out historically, and how they have been politically misconstrued or misunderstood in ways that are not productive in a pragmatic sense to the left movements, to the anti-establishment movements or anti-racist movements.
The race and class issues, I think, are very important. I don't think they're usually very well talked about. It came up for me this week in a strange way. The argument grew out of an incident involving the baseball team, the Boston Red Sox, and the Baltimore Orioles, playing in Fenway Park in Boston. A good black player for Baltimore was apparently assaulted with racial remarks, racial insults.
Adam Jones happens to be his name.
And our friend Jefferson Clare of Counterpunch wrote a note about it, pointing out that Boston was the most racist of the northern cities. Well, I'm not quite sure how you can make that calibration, that calculation, but it did lead me to think that there was still a peculiar cultural difference in American racism as to region. This may be a very deep-rooted prejudice of mine from my own personal history. I grew up in Northern Virginia in the 50s and 60s. But from the 60s to the 80s, I lived in Boston, and then now for a generation in the Midwest. And I do think that the quality, if that's the word, of racism on the East Coast, in the North and the South, really is different. And the key to the difference is found, I think, in a remark by, of all people, Lyndon Johnson, who, according to Bill Moyers, once said, "If you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man," this was Johnson in the 60s, "he won't notice you're picking his pocket. Hell, give him somebody to look down on, and he'll empty his pockets for you," close quote. Now, LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, butcher of Vietnam.
What could he have? I realize that maybe the emptying pockets is just meant metaphorically, but what is he even talking about? I mean, politically speaking, in terms of political programs, what is he even talking about?
He's
in
talking
terms of
about
emptying the white man's pockets?
No, he's talking about the way. Perhaps I did not present it with Johnson's peculiar rhetorical twist.
Yeah.
What he was saying was that the differentiation on the basis of race served economic interests of a ruling class that wants to make sure that it does not have a unified working class opposing it. So you convince the lowest white man that there are people lower than he on the totem pole that he doesn't want to be associated with. You give him someone to look down on, and the possibility of his organizing with that person to oppose you is very small. I think that's basically right. It's the reason when I was growing up that one could count on there being no effective unions in the construction trade in Virginia, where I lived and worked in the construction trade a little, because the unions were essentially segregated. And they were white unions. Blacks need not apply, and therefore a large section of the working class was excluded from the union movement, the result being employers were not troubled by unions in the South, in Virginia, particularly, which I knew about. And it's funny, what I'm suggesting is that the racial divide of the working class took different cultural forms in different American regions. And usually the best evidence for this from those days seems to me to be literary rather than sociological or political writing. The difference in race relations between the North and the South is better captured in Faulkner's fiction. And even now obscure novels from the era, such as one of the best, Lisa Alter's novel, Kinflix, from the 1970s, but really talking about the civil rights movement of the 1960s. What these literary artists did was depict the peculiar cultural divisions within the racial complexion of America that refracted what was really finally a class struggle. The emergence of identity politics was in fact a particularly malign cover story for class domination that drew upon these differences. When I tried to talk about what the difference in race relations in the North and the South, as I'd experienced it, the parallel that came to me was in fact from Alexis de Tocqueville. Tocqueville writing about the class relations of English and French in the years before the French Revolution, wrote, and I quote, "The French want no one to be their superior. The English want inferiors. The Frenchman constantly raises his eyes above him with anxiety. The Englishman lowers his beneath him with satisfaction." And I wanted to suggest the difference between the way in which class was handled via race in the North and South in America followed the same division. The Yankees, and when I Yankees here I mean the white working class in the North, the Yankees wanted no one to be their superior. This produced the sort of racism that our friend was talking about in Boston. The Yankees want no one to be their superior. The Southern white workers want inferiors, as Lyndon Johnson said. The Yankee constantly raises his eyes above him with anxiety. Are those people getting over me? Are they getting on to me? The Southerner lowers his beneath him with satisfaction because of the repression of blacks in the South, the continuation of modern slavery as I'm forgetting the name of the important book that talks about post-Civil War slavery.
You mean this C. Van Woodward?
No,
Strange Career
more
of Jim
recent
Crow.
than that. I'm sorry, I've come to me. But so all I'm suggesting is that
Yeah.
in the context of class,
Yeah.
racism in 21st century America has regional characteristics. Anxious and aggressive in the North, like Boston last week,
Yeah.
more settled, and therefore, in a peculiar sense, more companionable in the South. And those characteristics grow more pronounced as inequality accelerates. The system doesn't remain stable. And inequality accelerates as it is right now, and economic circumstances straighten for the majority of Americans. It's a moving system, but a system in which a race and class are intimately bounded up, but there are even regional differences in it.
Sure.
We can't generalize with complete confidence because there are too many factors, too many variables.
Yeah, it even, I mean, the reputation that Boston has had for being racist, for being sort of distinctively or peculiarly racist, is nothing new to me. I've since I was a child, I was sort of told that, and even living on the West Coast, and I always heard stories. And Jeffrey St. Clair recounts this case. I thought it was an off tone, not kind of a strange thing for him to spend as much space as he did trying to make the case that Boston is more racist than other East Coast cities or other northeastern cities in this athletics context.
Well, it may well be.
And without talking about the Irish, without talking about how complex the Irish experience has been.
That's certainly part of it.
Yeah, the whole thing. Yeah.
No, that's certainly that you've made this point, and it's a good one. That the peculiar oppression, indeed, it can't be called anything but racist, of the Irish in Boston from the 19th century on was particularly striking. I mean, there were parallel circumstances certainly in Chicago and New York, but Irish Boston remains a very real cultural location now, and it does feed into these issues on race and class. Those to whom evil is done do evil in return, says the poet.
Yeah.
And this seems to me to be part of the situation that one is dealing with in the American inner cities. The crucial question now is that the general immiseration of what we used to call the American middle class is proceeding. That's what elected Donald Trump, after all, and it's not stopping. It's getting worse. Inequality is not only increasing, it's accelerating in this country, and it's exacerbating these relationships. And therefore, this is something that our friend at Counterpunch knows perfectly well. But to note these regional differences, which he's not wrong about, is also to understand that they occur in a context of increasing social strains, social strains that a well-ordered government could do something about and isn't.
Well, I guess what concerns me, and also in the tone of Jeffrey's, in the context of the article, the long article that Jeffrey wrote, no, not the long article, but he didn't speak that long about it this morning, but still, in his kind of anti-Trumpist, I'm concerned that all this feeds into an inappropriate anti-Trumpism. Not that we shouldn't be anti-Trump, but that there's a sort of anti-Trumpism that wants to lump everything in together with opposing Donald Trump, when these race class issues transcend Donald Trump.
Exactly.
And that people on the people who think of themselves from liberal to left are somehow projecting back onto Trump and his supporters the kind of attitudes that they're sort of, reviving the kind of imagery of the 1960s with George Wallace supporters. And it seems to me that, we've begun to revise our understanding of the Northern Civil Rights Movement, how that played out in northern cities, and in the context of populism, right-wing populism, whatever you want to call it, the rise of people like Ed Koch, and St. Clair refers to the school busing issues in Boston in the 1970s, Louise Day Hicks. I'm sure you know all about that, right? But somehow he does it in this way that doesn't acknowledge that we need to begin to understand that era somewhat differently in terms of race and class.
Since my family was involved in it, it's hard for me not to comment on the school busing crisis in Boston, which is a background to these general observations that I was making. That crisis, and it was a serious one, was precipitated by a judge who lives on a tree-lined street in Wellesley, outside of Boston, and who ordered community schools based in what were largely ethnic or racial neighborhoods, Irish and black, to integrate their schools by busing students back and forth, mostly black students, back and forth across the city. There was a great deal of resistance in that, in some ways from both communities, on the grounds that these were neighborhood schools that were being forcibly dismantled by a judge from a different class, whose friends, neighbors, and children, if he had any, were not affected by the order. It was a very real problem, and the supposed racist objections, which certainly the description is apt, from Irish Boston, and you're right about that as well, was serious. But the notion that what was at stake here was simply white racism was false. There certainly was white racism involved. Much more importantly was the sort of class control that made the community schools a fair target for social engineering. It was a way to ignore questions of class, or indeed even suppress questions of class by pretending that they were questions of race. It was a vicious system, and a good solution was not found, and many people suffered in various ways.
Yeah, and so this may come as a surprise to many, but the liberal narrative of that era, the sort of modestly triumphant liberal narrative of that, the forces of justice triumphed somehow in programs for school busing, has to be added into a revisionist account of how liberal programs, in relation to the war on poverty and affirmative action and so forth, have played out over all these years in the context of course, in the context of all of the changes that we have seen in terms of the rise of the triumph of neoliberalism during that era. So it's kind of like, we're still back in the era where we think, well, we just have to get kids into school. We just have to integrate schools. We just have to get more black kids into college. We just have to do, and somehow it's begun to strike me as very, very hollow and very shallow. I don't take that rhetoric very seriously. I don't see how you can take seriously the notion that it's relevant to the solution of fundamental structural social problems to get people into college. Look at college. Yeah. What do they think college is? What about student debt? It just doesn't, it rings hollow at so many levels right now to me.
I think that's quite right, and it's part of the nefarious narrative of identity politics that people think that way.
Let me defend myself. Let me sort of preemptively defend myself by saying, of course I wanted my kid to go to college. Of course I want your kid to be able to go to college. Of course it's important. I understand that. There's two separate issues involved there, okay? And sure, in our personal lives, it's good if we could be, it's good if we could not be hypocritical in terms of our understanding of this. But I'm not making the argument that people shouldn't go to college or that we shouldn't have colleges. I'm just saying that that may be the answer to one kid's future, but it's not the answer to the future of black people or this country.
And it is peculiar.
or the working class.
And it is peculiar when the suggestion emerges for free college for Americans, as it did in this last campaign. It's
Yes.
put aside immediately, even though that's the case in all the other developed capitalist democracies, in inverted commas. And the argument with healthcare it has certain parallels here. We in this country do not do the things that are taken for granted in education and health elsewhere, and we should. We have only about 10 minutes left. Want to say something about France?
Yeah.
There's an election on Sunday.
Well, the thing I had in my mind to say is, what's Obama doing trying to influence the French elections? I mean, how outrageous and how stupid.
Yeah, perfectly reasonable.
Not surprising.
Look,
but
I think the place to begin is to realize that the French election, mutatis mutandis, is just like the American election, in that a neoliberal candidate is posed against an economic nationalist. We don't even have good language to talk about these positions, but and it's complicated in some sense by the fact that Trump in office has gone back on the economic nationalist things he was saying in the campaign. So it's difficult to sketch the contrast quite sharply as it should be. But Trump versus Clinton, in terms of what they actually said in the campaign, is quite parallel to Le Pen versus Macron. The latter, in both cases, represents a continuation of the neoliberal policies of all recent American and indeed French administrations. They would call it a government. Now, unfortunately, it's difficult, I think, for Americans to see that because of the intrusive word fascist. As soon as you call Marine Le Pen a neo-fascist, the argument ends. And it is impossible to see why she actually does have a substantial appeal to the to the French working class, the way that Trump has substantial appeal to the American working class. The parallels are quite great, but the accounts that we're getting obfuscates those parallels. I even had an argument with another literary friend of ours, Doug Henwood, on this point this week, where Doug, to my immense surprise, said, well, you can't take Le Pen seriously, she's a neo-fascist. Now, there are clever people out there writing about this in a good way, most notably Diana Johnstone, whose articles also appear, by the way, on Counterpunch regularly. But in the general discussion amongst liberals and the left, in the way that you were using the term earlier, of France, there's an awful lot of heat and very little light. And the beginning of wisdom is understanding that what Obama did is perfectly in character for both sides.
Yeah, no, I'm not surprised that obviously he supports the centrist neoliberal candidate. He supports a candidate who was groomed to govern for the ruling class, to be a front for the ruling class, in the same way that he himself was groomed to be a front for the ruling class in this country. And the other Johnstone, Caitlin Johnstone, wrote very well about that this past week, that we have to understand exactly. She uses some raw language, but to understand exactly how crappy the Obama presidency was, and how he deserves so little, and that it also I think that's okay. That's I'll leave that. It just I am, again, as I was saying last week, I'm wanting to know what people think Marine Le Pen is going to do if she is elected. It's pretty clear that she won't be. It's pretty clear. The polls are pretty accurate for the first round, and so they're using that as a way to say that they'll probably be accurate for this round. There's a little more of a factor about what the former Mélenchon voters are going to do, whether they're going to abstain, but it doesn't appear that enough of them would actually vote for Le Pen to swing it her way. So we'll be left with the same neoliberal predicament in France and in Europe. And just one more little footnote, as long as I was mentioning the London Review of Books, there's a very good German sociologist, Wolfgang Streeck,
Yes.
who writes very well about some of these issues. It's tough going, it's pretty dense writing, but if anybody really wants to understand Germany, you might try reading that article. It's a pretty complicated, but you might have a go at seeing what Wolfgang Streeck, who has written, he's published a book called How Will Capitalism End? Which is a collection of his essays that he's published mostly in the New Left Review over the past few years. So he's a person that is on my A list in terms of people to help me understand what's going on over there.
I'll put a link to this article that David's talking about on the Facebook page for News from Neptune, and I'll also include some other links to things that we've mentioned this evening. I would also want to point out there is a new journal, as it is described, seems parallel in some ways to the New Left Review, put out by the people who put out the Jacobin magazine, called Catalyst. And the folks we're speaking of here have been associated with it in various ways. The editors apparently are Robert Brenner and what's his name, Chibber.
Vivek Chibber.
Vivek Chibber. And I think that the first number includes a Streeck article.
Okay, good.
So it's there is a discussion going on here that actually is rather heartening, because it is not a repetition of tired orthodoxies. I don't mention Louis Proac directly, but if his name comes up, it would make sense. So there is some serious discussion going on here. You wouldn't know it, I think, from most American political writing these days, although, as you pointed out, things like the London Review of Books is a nice exception. London Review of Books has the role that the New York Review of Books did a generation and more ago, and that's not bad.
And I would only add by saying that a year from now we'll be celebrating the 200th anniversary of Karl Marx's birth, so maybe that will be a good omen for the next year in anti-neoliberal organizing.
You've been watching News from Neptune for the 18th week of 2017, a Marx and Mayo edition, not mayonnaise, but Cinco de Mayo, a Marx and Mayo edition, referring to the fact that today is the anniversary of the birth of Karl Marx in Trier in 1818 and the anniversary of the Battle of Puebla in Mexico in 1862. Carl Estabrook and David Green talking about the news of the week and its coverage by the media, produced and directed by Jason Liggett, Joseph Cash, and Andrew Scholarite. Our thanks to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, for research. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.